Angeles. I have worked with many of the folks both in the room and on the line around energy democracy, been very involved in local campaigns around local government and municipal control of energy utilities, as well as played around with people working on energy co-ops, like rural co-ops, and how do we transform rural electric co-ops, and have also helped to build a clean energy co-op here in Minneapolis that is doing community-owned renewable energy. I've spent quite a bit of time developing like popular education tools around the energy system, and really excited about this. So some of the discussions we've been having at the national level is how can this series as a pilot turn into a more closely tailored or easily accessible online set of trainings for groups around the country working on energy democracy. So just wanted to let people know about that and encourage people who have ideas or connections or want to take this in other directions to run with it and collaborate together to pull that forward as we see fit. I wanted to take just a moment to frame up today as well as how it fits into a broader series. About 2 months ago, a group of folks who participated in planning the Midwest Youth Climate Convergence came together for a discussion about what do we need to do as a climate movement, and among many other action items, one of the kind of big priorities that came up was figuring out how do we drive the utility death spiral, and we're not going to get super far into exactly what the utility death spiral is today, but at our next session we will. But that kind of tied into a desire for a deeper understanding of why is energy significant in terms of transforming society, not just from a climate perspective, but from an economic perspective. What are the specific opportunities going on right now that are changing the face of the energy system, that are happening even without us and social movements in general? And then how do social movements use those levers to create change in a way that builds community wealth, brings down the power of monopoly utilities, and builds up energy democracy in our communities? And so through a series of emails with some people who are interested in this training, primarily Patty and Alexandra here, and then Sean, who I don't think is with us right now, but several of you know, came together this format of a series of 4 trainings. Today is really focused on kind of the why, in terms of why energy is significant as a tool for changing the way societies work. And also kind of the background of how does our energy system work right now, and then how did that emerge and why. We're not going to get too far into the cool, exciting levers for change that are emerging right now in our session today. That's going to be the big focus of our second session, which I'll send out a reminder about the dates, but I think it's like May 17th or something like that. Mm-hmm. And then the third one is digging more into community wealth building models. And the fourth is moving from community wealth building models in general to community wealth building models around energy democracy. So you've probably all seen some information about that, but both for all of you here and for future viewers, just wanted to kind of do that lineup. I am not super familiar with doing these hybrid in-person and webinar type trainings. So if something is just not working in terms of the way I'm sharing information or using board space, y'all can let me know. I'm particularly talking to the folks on the computer here.
I have a suggestion too. If you want to just put in the chat box like an asterisk, if you want to talk or say something, I can monitor that. And let Timothy know that one of you wants to speak or jump in.
Cool.
Or just directly write things into the chat box, like questions, if you don't feel like unmuting yourself. But I can keep an eye on that.
Awesome. Yeah, and I'm going to try and make this as interactive as possible. That's obviously easier for me to see when people who are in the room have questions or want to jump in. But again, if you're on the computer, please either speak up or, as Patty said, put it in the chat box. So I wanted to start with the question of why energy, and this is taking it a little bit of a level beyond just energy is important, just like everything else is important, because obviously our food system is important, our housing system is important, our financial system is important, I mean, all these things are important and we need to change them. But I personally think that energy is particularly important in the present moment. And one of the curiosities that people had setting this up was, why do I think that? And so I'm going to take just a little bit of time talking about the whys there. And some of that will actually come into the second session, where we talk about what's happening right now that makes energy sort of a hot opportunity in social change in the next 5 to 10 years particularly. But I wanted to start by talking a little bit about, and we're going to have some discussion here, about the ways human society has structured itself. I can't claim to speak for since the beginning, but for quite a long while back, because I think one of the things that it's very valuable to illustrate is that to a very large degree, the way we have organized our society is around our energy source. And that's kind of a key realization here. So I'm going to go up here, and I am hoping that this little chart thing is visible to all you on the computer. And we're going to talk about some different ways that people have organized. Maybe I'll actually stand over here. That people have organized their society in different energy paradigms. And I'm particularly going to focus on is the form of energy that is dominant in that society widely available, meaning is it kind of everywhere, or is it only in certain places? Is it concentrated, meaning do you have energy in a form where you can get a lot of power out of it easily? So I don't mean geographically concentrated, I mean is your form of energy something where you can get a lot of force out of it very efficiently? Is it versatile? So can you use it for a lot of different things in society? What is its overall abundance? What's the absolute amount? And then some just space for us to talk about some of the innovations that have driven societies as we look at energy. So I'm going to start with maybe the, again, I can't speak for what happened hundreds of thousands of years ago, but what I think of as the beginning structure of society, which is a hunter-gatherer society. So can anyone share, what you see as the primary sources of energy in a hunter-gatherer society?
Fire. Wait, wood.
Okay, so we have our energy sources, our wood, which is relatively widely available. What else?
Sun, very warm.
Yep, sun. And the sun particularly translates into one specific thing that we use for most of our energy in a hunter-gatherer society, which is food. So this could be animals, this could be plants, all sorts of things that you go wandering around and find, and then you eat them. And at a certain point, you figure out fire, and you can prepare that food using fire as an energy source. And you use that food to do all of your walking around and all that type of thing. There's a very simple energy balance in that society. If you cannot find enough calories in your walking around and chasing things down and pulling things off of plants, if you cannot find enough calories by doing that to keep walking around and chasing things down and pulling things off of plants, over time you die. And of course you're doing it cooperatively, and pretty soon we got good at taking down mammoths and all these giant animals which have lots of calories in them. But that's basically the energy equation in a hunter-gatherer society. Okay, energy is widely available. There's little bits of food all over the place. The sun is there. In many places, although not other places, wood is widely abundant, or grass, or in some deserts, camel dung, or various things like that. So it's kind of there, and our density as a human society existed largely based on the density of these resources. Okay, it's not very concentrated. You could say probably the largest concentrations of energy in this society are big game animals. You could take down a mammoth and suddenly everyone in the village gets to eat. But this is not a concentration of energy that would allow you to build cities, for example, or centralize the technology and knowledge to create the internet. So it's very dispersed, little bits of energy all over the place. I'm going to argue that while the energy in the system is very versatile from an ecological perspective, it's not very versatile from a human system or economic perspective. Please stop me or interpose if you want to say anything here. I'm going to say industrially no. Okay? This energy is mostly good for staying warm and running human bodies, which is great and worked out wonderfully for quite a long time. And its abundance. It's actually relatively abundant, but in terms of the absolute amount of energy that's available, it's pretty low. Is this all making sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And we can talk about some key innovations, fire, language, key innovation. I'm going to spell language totally wrong. You get the idea. Does anybody else want to throw out some other innovations from this energy era?
Would wind have been used much as a tool, as a useful?
I honestly don't know. As far as I can imagine, the only thing that wind would have been used for would have been like sailing, and I honestly don't know if sailing was a pre-agricultural invention. I don't know if anyone knows that, but maybe.
Would tools like spear or
tool
be considered there?
Also, just wanted to check, can those of you on the computer see anything I'm writing?
We got...
Mostly yes. It's a ways away. And there's some glare that's not too helpful, but mostly yes.
Okay.
It helps to have you. I think if I wasn't watching you write it, it would be more challenging. But given that, it's useful as a memory device.
Cool. Great. I will also try and switch to a slightly darker color. And we will try with the lights. I'm going to kind of speed through these just for the sake of getting kind of an example of why I think this is important. So don't feel like we're trying to cover all the important details of how societies are affected by these energy systems. We're going to move to an important second paradigm, which started to be a primary way of organizing civilizations starting about 8,000 or 9,000 years ago, which is agriculture. So what are our primary energy sources in an agricultural society?
Animals?
Animals.
Human labor?
Yep. Sometimes voluntary, sometimes not.
Food?
And it's still the things in the first column to an extent.
Yep. Sun.
Food, but more food, right?
Water, more food. Okay. We are now harnessing the reproductive activities of animals and plants and stewarding them in certain directions so that they are more productive for human use. there's some important innovations here that I want to point out, or I want to invite people to point out. What are some of the big innovations in the agricultural era that allow us to use energy differently?
Using the stored energy in the soil.
Yep.
A granary to store food.
Yep.
Irrigation.
More for the food system, since it, like, as opposed to following a herd, you can create food when you're back.
So I'm going to say portability and also food transport systems.
Irrigation.
Irrigation, yeah.
Would that include the things like mills and using rivers to help grind up stuff?
Sooner or later, yeah. I don't know how early on milling was invented or adapted, but yes, definitely. I don't know this for a fact. Like, I don't know that there are no pre-agricultural civilizations that did this, but I think that we could say at least that slavery is an important innovation of this era, at least making it a mass phenomenon. Again, not saying anything there about whether this is an advance in any way, just saying this is a thing, okay? We're using very concentrated animal labor and human labor to do all of the stuff that we couldn't do before. Yep. One thing I really want to emphasize here is that one of the key conversions in this era is we figured out how to use animals to convert ecosystems that were not very good at producing human calories into human calories. So a lot of ecosystems are grasslands, which don't have an awful lot of things that people can eat in them because it's mostly grass, which is cellulose, which we can't do very much with. But you can graze sheep on it. And you can eat sheep or drink their milk or cattle or goats or whatever you want. So, yeah, grazing. Okay, so concentrated. Still not all that concentrated, but a little bit more concentrated. You can build a city off of this.
Artificial selection.
Cool.
This husbandry kind of comes from that. I'm not sure how accurate this is, but like I heard Gunther and Steel. There's an argument about the availability of grains in certain areas for production, and like it's not quite GMO, but like intentionally leaving.
So we start selecting species to do what we want them to do. I'm going to kind of move away from the innovations. There's definitely more of them, but really focusing now on, okay, the concentration. It's somewhat more concentrated, especially concentrated in areas with highly fertile soil or large grazing land. In terms of versatility, it's somewhat more versatile. You're still primarily feeding ecological beings, whether it's humans or animals. But you can start using that labor to build walls or grind things or dig ditches to move water or various things like that because you have more energetic surplus to do that. But you still have this basic equation of your calories in, the food that you produce through the animals and all that stuff that you do, has to feed all the people and all of the animals, or they all starve. Or enough of them starve that you have a problem.
More diverse labor system.
Yep. So, so we can talk about urbanization and how that ties in here. In terms of abundance, how much total energy is available for human activity? It's medium. There's quite a bit more. during this period, we saw, as far as we can tell, pretty significant increases in human population, and also lots of things that we never saw before in terms of cities and the beginnings of empires and armies and all of that type of thing. Okay, broad stroke, is this painting something of a picture? Okay, just for the sake of time, I'm going to jump a couple of steps ahead. We're going to skip the kind of steam and coal age, which you can picture here, and we're just going to go straight to what I'm going to call the coal, gas, oil, and nuclear age. Okay, actually, I'm going to give myself a little bit more space than that. Just, I'm trying to illustrate a basic point. Are these energy sources widely available? How widely distributed are they?
You look at rough year.
Steam and coal, let's say 1820s to 1850s is the emergence. Oil and gas really kind of started developing as a significant industry in the late 19th century, much more prominent in the early 20th century. Nuclear is obviously post-World War II. So all of these, until we got to about here, you have some disparity in where you have food and wood and, to some extent, sunlight, based on how far north or south you are. But they're all pretty evenly distributed. How about these types of things? How evenly distributed are they?
Well, they're all over, but there are areas like rural areas that didn't get like electrical wires or pipes for gas or whatever.
Mm-hmm. So I want to note that you're talking about the infrastructure we have built to distribute the energy, which is important in terms of thinking how, and we're going to talk a lot more about that, but in terms of where the energy itself is.
I would guess that it's in a lot of different places, but in certain places there's a lot more of it than other places.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to just put concentrated in specific areas. Okay.
So it apply to, I would think that would apply to coal and gas, but not nuclear. So
it applies to nuclear as well. In fact, the places where you can mine uranium or other things that you can use in those reactors are only available in a very few places.
Sure, I guess it's interesting how that's been distributed.
Cool. We have created infrastructure to move this energy from where it is to where we use it.
Yeah.
And this becomes important, as we'll talk about later, in terms of who owns and controls that infrastructure. But the point is we have to have an infrastructure to get this energy from where it is to where we use it, whereas in all these things we just use it where it is. Okay?
So you're talking about where it originates.
Yes. Like, I mean, maybe this is sort of like it's hard to answer the question because it just feels obvious, but I just want to point out in all of these cases, we have relatively few instances where we are collecting energy and then sending it somewhere else.
Well, our intelligence agencies have learned that someone sought uranium from Niger.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, I mean, there's historically there's specific ways.
Yep.
Yeah.
Great. So, just one thing to note, we are on the, people are watching online, so just whenever you're speaking, try and speak up as much as possible.
Sure.
In terms of concentration, how much raw power can you get from a small, volume or weight of energy here?
A lot.
Great, a lot. Very concentrated.
Very. All of those are.
I was once told an analogy that I find fascinating. Imagine, a semi-trailer. A semi-trailer can carry somewhere around 80,000 pounds. 1 gallon of gasoline, diesel, will push that 80,000 pound semi-trailer about 5 miles up a shallow incline. If you were to take that 80,000 pounds and put it in a hand truck, let's say you were carrying like 200 pounds per trip, and you're walking 5 miles up that shallow grade and going back, it's going to take you about 6 months of your physical labor to move that same amount of weight, that same distance, as 1 gallon of diesel fuel. Okay? We have access to incredibly concentrated energy right now that allows us to do all sorts of stuff that are would be unimaginable to most societies that have ever existed. We find it economically feasible to move fruit from the other side of the planet. Okay, that's not conceivable in virtually any of these other societies, even really the Stephen Cole Society. Yeah, even just 50 years ago. Let's talk about versatility. The big thing I haven't explicitly mentioned up here, but in terms of versatility that we really need to mention, is electricity. So this energy system is extremely versatile. So you can use it to feed people and animals and all of that type of thing. You can also use it to make pharmaceuticals or move electrons in a computer chip. You can use it to send an email. I could go on with examples forever. Virtually everything we do in our society uses one of these energy systems in some form. Okay, think about all of the things that we do that use electricity, or that use batteries that are charged with electricity, or that move around using gas or jet fuel, or all of those types of things. And many of those we don't even see, like how stuff gets shipped to us. Okay, and there's all these things we can do we couldn't do before. Okay, abundance, extremely high. We have so much energy available to us all the time, but it's limited in the long run. And we could talk about innovations here forever, but does somebody just want to give me like, or can collect like 5 innovations that are key to this energy system?
Capitalism.
Capitalism, very important innovation. You could argue that capitalism did emerge. We also missed another one in here, which was sort of the early industrial revolution, like water wheels and all of that type of thing. And one could say that metal forging, gunpowder, and sails were kind of the origin energy system of capitalism. But definitely capitalism has gotten supercharged with a lot more power, literal and figurative, than it ever had before under the system.
Trade commerce and things like overland for shipping.
Yep.
Like that, right.
Trade and transportation, like global. Okay. What are some other innovations that we used in the system?
Personal transportation, like automobiles.
Yep. Cars. I'm gonna add one. Computers. No computers without electricity, as far as I know.
Manufacturing of all kinds of stuff, plastic and fabric and
Sure.
stuff.
All that stuff.
Cool. And we could add things like social media and the internet and all sorts of other things that emerge out of the system if we're going to take the time. But I would just invite you to think about all of the things that you use day to day and that we assume are normal that have become possible and emerged out of this energy system. And we could talk about how this then influences how we do food, how we do housing, the nature of money and how we do finance, how corporations are set up and how people are employed, what does the education system look like. You can follow these threads for a whole bunch of different organizing systems. And rather than try and explain all of this or kind of capture the totality of it, I just want to use this as an indicator of some of the questions to ask when we look at how does this system work, the system we live in, how does it work compared to some of the other systems that have been dominant at various points in history in terms of how people have organized their lives. And again, we could spend hours and hours talking about the details, but I just want to invite you to start asking those questions about how does the world we live in start to flow from the energy paradigm that we're in. I'm going to real quick do one more, and we don't really even know all the innovations yet because we're making them. But over here, we have the renewable energy system, which I am more and more convinced that I will live in someday. And we're already on the path. And how we do it matters a lot. Let's do this first column. How widely available is it?
Super available.
Very available. But it's not universal. There is some, different places where the sun is better, different places where the wind is better, where there's water power, where there's geothermal. It is locally specific.
So what populations and locations is it so available? A lot of the world doesn't have access to the resources to put up solar panels or wind turbines.
So we are not yet at a point where we have made mass available or have democratized the technology to capture this energy source. And that's a big piece of the problem that is people working on energy democracy that we need to address. The thing to point out here is that the resource itself is widely available. It's relatively easy if you are trying to control the wealth to buy up the land and put a fence around all the places that have coal or oil or nuclear because they're discrete and concentrated. It's much harder to monopolize sunshine. Not saying that somebody won't try someday. But just that it's harder because of the nature of the energy source. Okay, how concentrated is it? I heard something on the computer.
I wouldn't say it's as concentrated as the previous.
Yep. So not as much as that, but more so in most cases than kind of the hunter-gatherer and agricultural systems.
Yeah.
You can get a lot of power out of highly efficient solar and wind technology in a relatively small area.
Is there any concentration around things like, there should be a equator, you mentioned, but also like jet stream, wind, or rivers, and in terms of hydrocarbons?
Yep, there's totally local concentration. Oh, are you trying to? Maybe there's an echo. Cool. There's totally some local concentration. Versatility.
Very versatile.
Very versatile. I'm going to add one qualifier to that, especially electric. To the extent that we can make electricity from renewable sources, it is just as versatile as making electricity from all those other sources, and electricity is probably our most versatile form of energy out there.
What is it not as versatile? Like
It is not as versatile for concentrated liquid fuel. You know, there are people who are working on algae-based biofuel and switchgrass and various things like that, and of course we have ethanol, which is not terribly efficient right now, but we don't really have a renewable energy solution that can deliver the same power in the same format as the things that we make gasoline or jet fuel out of. That's not a solution that exists yet. It's not entirely clear how we could get to that solution unless you electrify transportation, and that's not super efficient because you're using a highly refined and highly processed form of energy, being electricity, for just sort of the brute power function of pushing things around. But, you know, maybe it will happen. My ideological and movement side doesn't really want it to happen because I'm very interested in how we get to a society that focuses less on the brute force task of moving things around, which is kind of the fact that it's so easy for us to move stuff around is contrary to localism and local control and a bunch of all those types of things. But I can't predict the future, so maybe it will be resolved and maybe it won't, and that has major social and political implications. And abundance. Does anybody have...
Infinitely readily abundant.
Okay. You know, there's a lot of people who say, you know, there's just not enough energy around. I read a statistic that the amount of solar energy that hits the Earth in one day is more than all the fossil fuel and nuclear energy that we have ever used.
What?
You have to remember that in addition to being able to produce our electricity, it is also keeping the planet warm and moving the oceans and like generating rain and growing all the plants and doing all this other useful work that it has been doing forever and ever and ever. So highly abundant, massively abundant, not limited in any foreseeable future.
Highly massively abundant.
Okay? I mean, theoretically, when the sun burns out in 5 billion years, we'll have a problem, but I don't think we're going to be here in 5 billion years, and that's not a problem to me.
That one we can pass down to the next generation.
Right, the next generation has to deal with that one. That's just fine. But it is not abundant in the same like concentrated, it's all in one place, you can do whatever you want with it kind of way. It's much more diffuse and much more distributed. And I'm going to leave it to our future discussion to talk about what are the innovations of this system, partially because I don't know what they are yet, and partially because even the ones that I do know a little bit of what they are, we don't need to do it for the purposes of comparing these. I just wanted to do a little bit of a gut check. This is obviously not talking anything about the details of how we got to the energy system we have today, but just as a kind of way of thinking about how energy systems change society. Is this useful?
I didn't know so.
Got some nods? No.
Yes.
Okay.
From Anastasia.
Cool.
Universal yes.
Universal yes. Okay. I'm going to erase this unless people are dying to have me not erase it. People can take a picture if you want. This is also a great time if you wanna ask questions or put in a thought while we're transitioning to a new kind of content block or idea. Go ahead.
Are you going to talk about how capitalism loves the fact that the coal, gas, nuclear, electricity is concentrated so they can get their stuff on it and the accessibility of the other side?
Yes, definitely. Yep, coming to that. And I am hanging up. Nope, this is not something here.
Adam, do you want to say something?
Yeah. The idea of a renewable energy system, to me, one of the biggest disagreements in how society could evolve around it is that question you brought up, Timothy, of do we use the renewable energy to keep a highly mobile, kind of same level of energy sophistication, but just scale it up and try to capture as much renewable energy as possible, or do we intentionally use less energy? And I'm wondering how, if we're going to get into that, and that's one of the biggest questions for me in terms of where we're going. And I think that's a big division that, for the most part, the movement doesn't talk about, because we've clarified that we want to stop fossil fuels, but then what type of energy system, like how much energy we're using in the future, I feel like that's a big question mark and a lot of disagreement there.
Yeah, I'm not going to attempt to answer that question, partially because my best answer is it could go either way, and that's a political and movement choice that's going to play out over the next several decades, as opposed to necessarily something that is inherent or technological. The thing I will say is, in terms of absolute amount of energy available, there is more than enough energy available through renewable sources to do everything, okay, with the possible exception of jet fuel and airplanes, to do virtually everything that we do right now. That does not mean that it is efficient even in an economic sense to continue doing it that way. It is much cheaper and more affordable, and from an infrastructure perspective, much less costly to develop a renewable energy system that is focused on efficiency and doing the basic minimum of what we need. And while our system has not necessarily been designed to date around what is most economically efficient, it's generally been designed around what is most economically profitable. Without going too far into the details before we've really gotten to that stage, there's some inefficiencies in the economics of renewables if you do it in such a wasteful way that you're trying to cover everything that we currently do. So there's some reasons to think that renewable energy will at least nudge us in the direction of more lower energy, more local, and smarter uses of energy, as opposed to just do everything the same with wind and solar. I have no idea to what degree, like what proportion of that versus just using new fuel to do the same stuff.
Will, do you want to go?
Yeah, this is really terrific. Very much enjoying this so far, so thanks. Question jumps right off of where you were just finishing up, and I just wanted to ask about the people who are in like the peak oil crowd, who essentially say we're not going to get the technological innovation in order to power industrial society as it currently exists, and if we try, we're likely to experience a rather chaotic and unmanaged, unplanned decline in the absolute level of energy available to us. Basically, like, that's what I worry about all the time, and I want to know what you think about it. So maybe that's another conversation, but I wanted to throw it out there.
Yeah, I think this is kind of putting a finer point on what just got asked, and I really appreciate that. I maybe should have been a little bit more direct in my discussion of the limitations or the expensiveness. Building a renewable energy system that is capable of capturing enough energy to do all of the stuff that we do now would be a massive infrastructure build out. Like, I don't even mean large, like highway system scale. I mean, it is hard for me to imagine how big that build out of infrastructure would be. And I don't know if our economy, I don't know if the global economy could accommodate it. It is technologically possible. I don't know if it is economically or politically possible. And it is incredibly wasteful. The amount of stuff you need to build just to get, sorry, I'm kind of getting way ahead of myself here in terms of explaining why. So
Just the ballpark, like how many Marshall plans?
I have no idea. The question was how many Marshall plans? I mean, if you're talking globally, at least 10,
Okay.
maybe 20 or 50, I don't know. And yes, specifically on this issue of liquid fuel, I think that there are major technological barriers to producing energy in a form that allows us to do all of the same things that we can do with liquid fuel. Potentially electric cars are getting close enough to allow us to do that for personal transportation, which honestly kind of scares me. But that doesn't solve the issue for airplanes or mass global shipping or those types of things. And I honestly don't know if we have the precious metal resources to build electric cars for, 3 billion people or roughly however many people are driving nowadays.
Those aren't like hydrogen cell based?
No, they're battery based. And hydrogen cells don't actually create energy. Yeah.
Storage, transportation.
Totally. Are there any other kind of pressing questions, just sort of about this like big paradigm? How does energy change society before we move on?
Do we have any functional examples of recent major shifts in energy, and underlying infrastructural energy usage turning out very well that we can use as reference models, something like that?
So the question was transitions to energy that turned out well. I assume by well, the values that we're talking about are democratic, sustainable, socially just. There are certain specific places that are well endowed with certain types of renewable energy that have done that in what I would say is pretty well. Places that come to my mind right now are Iceland, New Zealand, some of the Scandinavian countries, largely because they have abundant hydroelectric or geothermal. And hydroelectric is complex and sticky, so I'm not going to go too far into that right now. In terms of like big historic shifts, I don't think we do. The one thing I wanted to draw people's attention to makes you nervous. Yeah, the situation we are in is definitely an appropriate place to be nervous, but still creative and looking forward. The one thing that we didn't mention here is what is the governance or political structure of these different types of societies. And I'm not going to go too far into that, but I just want to note they are very different. And one of the core questions, and again, I'm going to pose these more as questions than trying to argue why I've come to the answers that I have. But one of the questions I'd invite you to think about is how do these energy systems, these different energy systems, allow people to do things that concentrate or distribute control of different types of resources? And therefore, the control of those resources, how does that result in the concentration or distribution of wealth, which is highly related to the concentration or distribution of political power? And really thinking about energy as our ability to do things in a society, and how does our energy system structure the types of things we're able to do and who gets to do them, and how does that then play into the broader like economic and political context that sets the rules. I do want to note that most of the things we think of as normal in our society, like getting a job, going to work, attending full primary education, and even going to college. Most of those things were not norms before the Industrial Revolution. Most people before somewhere in here were farmers. So these questions about the energy system that we live in have massive implications, not just for the political system, but also like, what is the norm or expectation for your aspiration as a human being? The fact that is in most of our heads nowadays as 21st century people of the thing I do is a job, that would not have occurred to the average person in the year 1850. That was just starting to be a thing that ordinary people did en masse. And that was 160 years ago. So just wanted to tie us into thinking about this, not just at a technological end, but how does it feed politics, economics, and also like culture and human psychology.
Real quick, it was within the last 15 years or so, I believe, something in the last 15 years, so I believe that we officially got to like more than 50% of the population is living in urban environments.
Yep. So urbanization is also tied very much into the cycle of this.
Which is very, very distinct in that shift, given that agriculture is how most of us comes in the first place.
Yep. That's cool. So I'm going to erase this and move on. All good? Oops. Thank you. So for the remainder of this series, both today and later, I'm going to be talking primarily about energy utilities. And I want to distinguish that as something that is separate from but also connected to the oil and gas industry. So we use oil and gas separate from energy utilities as transportation fuel and for making plastics and chemicals and various other industrial processes. And all of that is highly important. I'm not going to focus on it as much because most of the highly refined energy, which nowadays is primarily electricity, that kind of shapes sort of where our economy is going. It does not come from oil, and although increasingly it is coming from gas, so there is a connection. A lot of it is coal and nuclear and now renewable energy. The other reason that I'm not going to focus on it as much, although there is a connection, is that a lot of the big opportunities in sort of the economic forces that are changing, that I think are a huge opportunity, are related to the structure and the economic functioning of energy utilities and how does that relate to local control of energy. I think in the utility sector, there is a huge opportunity for us as movements. Again, this is going to take a lot of work and at least a decade, probably 2 or 3. There's huge opportunity to take over the structure and function of an industry in a way that reworks society. I don't think we will be taking over or restructuring the oil and gas industry if we win. I think we will be shutting it down. And these struggles are very interrelated because increasingly natural gas in particular is a huge piece of, well, it is almost the entirety of our heating fuel in large parts of the country. And it is also increasingly a primary fuel for electricity. So what happens in the utility market has a huge influence on the oil and gas market. But I do want to make kind of a distinction in what we're talking about around that before we go too much further.
Just a quick question, like, it's partially around the dialogue planning that we discussed this issue in this country, in the world and so forth, but like, I'm guessing that the natural gas right now is significantly produced in fracking.
Yes.
Okay, so I don't see any fossil fuel version of anything that isn't suicidal as a plant.
Sure.
So it's an interesting like transition in even we're talking about this way or like I'm like, okay, so we're gonna do the non-gigantically suicidal part or whatever. I don't know, the way that we discuss this has a narrative that I think mollifies the problem in a way that's disturbing. I guess you got what I'm doing? Okay.
Sure.
I just think that it's important to notice that when we're talking about transitioning, if we can't find something that works outside of the existing system, then that's game. So we kind of have to focus in that direction.
Totally. Cool. So, for quite a long time, there was no electric light, and there was no centrally distributed heat. The way you heated your building was initially with wood. You burned a wood fire to generate heat. In particularly England and Germany a couple hundred years ago, they started to run out of wood because there was enough people and not enough wood, and all their forests were disappearing. So they started burning coal, and very few places in the West still burn coal for heating because it is awfully polluting. They dug it. They dug it out of the ground with pickaxes, and they invented trains to carry more of it. In large parts of rural China, they still heat their houses with coal. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, is that these systems that we kind of think of and talk about as hundreds of years ago are still alive and well in certain parts of the world, and we need to be thinking about how we deal with that. One of the kind of, and at the same time, during that same point, we were lighting our buildings with oil lamps. Are you all familiar with the kind of big whaling era when all these people were going around killing all of the whales? We didn't put this up there on our big chart, but for quite a while, whales were our primary source of indoor lighting. And our energy source, our strategic energy reserve, was the whales in the world's oceans. And we started to run out of whales. Primarily lighting, yes. And we started to run out of whales. I'm like, that's tragic and ridiculous and whatever, but like, think of that in large part as an energy crisis. You know, we're obviously killing massive amounts of marine life, but anyway. So there was this invention of electric light, and there was kind of a multi-stage thing. I won't go into the details, but there was arc lighting and various other types of early lighting that we wouldn't really recognize as electric light. But you know, finally in the latter part of the 19th century, people figured out how to turn electricity into light. And light was one of the primary uses of electricity, and only shortly after got turned into household appliances and all of these other things to use electricity. Just to,
telegraph?
Telegraph was another key use of electricity, so communication.
There was actually a comment on here a couple minutes ago, just a quick clarification, that a huge part of the world is still burning wood for fuel.
Yes.
Colin.
Totally. Yeah. Both for heating and cooking.
I said that like 10 seconds before Timothy said that, so it didn't matter.
Oh, sorry.
So I want to stress there's a book that I read that if you're really interested in sort of the cultural evolution of this, is really valuable. It's called Disenchanted Night. The author is Wolfgang Schimmelbusch or something like that. He's basically, the Disenchanted Night is sort of how people's relationship to light and heat changed because of corporate electrification. So it used to be that if you wanted light in your house, you made or at least bought and trimmed and managed your own candles. It came from a very clear source that you did something to manage. You built the fire, maybe you even chopped your own wood. You had a very direct and intimate relationship with your own energy. And one of the things that was deeply creepy for people when electricity and pretty soon later piped gas for heating started to be distributed was, whoa, all of a sudden there's this invisible outside entity that is in control of your power. And I think it's like important just to realize that like that was a weird thing then. And nowadays it's having a direct relationship to your power. That's a weird thing nobody has ever thought about. But this was a real kind of cultural fight. Like, do we want to give up control over our lighting and our heating to these companies that are charging us money for it? And this is the early emergence of the electrical system. 1880s, 1890s.
For Western Europe or the US?
Western Europe and the US. Again, much of the US didn't get electricity until much later, even the 1930s and 40s, but this is kind of emergence. So you all know about Thomas Edison. We could talk about Tesla later, but there was this invention of the power plant. Back in the day, they used to call them dynamos. And it was seen as this massive industrial power. The funny thing is that these electric generators, by today's standards, were tiny. They were building these giant power plants that were, 1 or 2 or 3 megawatts. Nowadays we don't bring on a natural gas plant unless it's 120 megawatts at least, and some of our coal plants are thousands of megawatts. So the scale has totally changed. But essentially the original idea was there's an interest in street lighting in households, and maybe like industrial plant that wants electricity to run its not generators, but motors or machines or whatever like that. I'll get to the question in just a moment. And so the original model was, we're going to build a power plant, and I think the first of these, an electric power plant, was actually in downtown Manhattan, in the middle of the city. And we're going to run some wires to the house immediately around, and the big factory building next door, and like everything else in like a 4 or 5 block radius. And that's what this power plant is for. So yeah, this was the beginning of the power industry. And that was the idea. We're not trying to create a grid. We're just trying to provide electricity to this small little area right here. Question?
Writer?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to mention to your point of like basically us having given away our autonomy towards having other entities take care of our energy, and if you and I think we know that this is something that's historically has been the pattern, right? You have something and then they take it away from you and then either sell it back to you or give it to you for some kind of token. They did the same thing for money, so like, give us your money, we'll hold your money for you. And so all, banks are created the same way. Now, they did the same with energy. It's a distributed web, and now information is going to be the next thing where we'll give us your information, we'll put your information into a cloud, and you can pay us to get your information back from you. So I just see how everything is kind of going together. So.
Yep. Totally. Thanks for pointing that out. I think it's a big trend here in the way our economy's been going. what happened pretty soon, and another book that I found really powerful that I just read, it's called The Power Brokers. It kind of profiles different eras of the development of the electric industry. One of Edison's subordinates, who kind of quickly became one of the leaders of the electric utility industry, was, I think it's Sam Insull. I don't remember. I think, yeah. Insull is the guy. I can't do this. So he started his networks in Chicago. And pretty soon what was happening was you'd have your one power plant distributing to this neighborhood, and some other private business would say, I want to serve this neighborhood, and I'm going to build a power plant, and I'm going to serve this area, and another person says, I'm going to serve this area. And pretty soon, because the most cost-effective way to do it, like the least number of wires, was to sort of pick the biggest energy users, like the biggest factories and manufacturing facilities, and build your power plants around that. You'd had all these little different power companies in the same city kind of going around and saying, I'll build this for you and I'll build this for you, and competing with each other. So originally this was all competitive, and a whole bunch of different companies trying to serve everyone at the same time. Go ahead.
So at the time, are these companies that are kind of vying for location rights to like serve their communities and businesses and stuff?
They're vying for location rights, and they're also vying for customers. So it's partially where is the plant built, but also whose usage do you get to serve. And interestingly, it wasn't initially the government that said, this is ridiculous, we have to regulate it. It was Insull and his companies who essentially said, look, all these different little companies setting up their own power plants in different neighborhoods is a bad idea. It's creating inefficiency because all these people are running their wires down the same streets. These plants are too small. They'll be much more efficient if we build bigger ones. And again, bigger at the time was small compared to nowadays. And really what we should do is we should give one company, which of course happened to be his company, control of all of the energy service, for, in this case, Chicago. So we're going to call this a natural monopoly, and this is the language that still gets used for today. Natural monopoly. To say that the most efficient way to distribute electricity is to have one company that serves the entire area. And they're the only ones who get to run their power lines down the streets and serve all the customers in the area. Now, there is some sense to this, because imagine what our streets would look like if everyone on the block had a different power provider and they each built their own wires. You just have a tangle of wires everywhere. And people would be paying much more for all of that redundant infrastructure. So there is some sense to the idea that a grid, there should only be one grid. You shouldn't have all these companies building their own grid. But this idea that the actual generation of power should be just one company, I believe has gotten more and more outdated, partially because we now have a grid that isn't just localized like this, it's interconnected all over the place. And also because in this system, part of what drove efficiency was that your power plant got cheaper per unit the larger you built the power plant. So in the early part of the century, they were building 10 megawatt power plants. And by the middle of the century, they were building 100 megawatt power plants. And now we build 1,000 megawatt power plants. So there was this rush towards centralization. And over time, you got bigger and bigger plants that were connecting a much larger area. All making sense?
Mm-hmm.
The primary fuel for this early on was coal. And pretty soon you had these very large coal burning facilities in the middle of New York City and in the middle of Chicago and in the middle of all these other load centers. And people started dying. In fact, people were dying for several decades from this whole cycle of things. black lung, all sorts of respiratory diseases. I mean, they weren't even really familiar with what cancer was at the time, but that too. You know, a whole suite of things just because the air was toxic. So increasingly, they started to make the decision, we should move these power plants out of communities where people are making a big fuss, which either meant moving them to rural communities far away from the city where there's not very many people, or siting them in low-income communities and communities of color where people are not making a very big fuss, or at least not a fuss that matters politically. And so that kind of established this trend that you see of big power plants being located in communities of color, low-income communities, and way far out. There was also in the teens and 20s, and much more so in the 30s, there was a strong reaction on the left to all of this corporate power, like literally corporate power. The monopoly control of the energy supply, and the fact that they were just making a killing, because if you wanted electricity, and pretty soon people realized that they wanted electricity, you had to buy it from this monopoly company, and they could set whatever rates they wanted. So the federal government started stepping in and saying, we are going to compete. We are actually going to generate our own energy and sell it at lower prices to cities and customers competing with these private companies. And this was the Tennessee Valley Authority that built all those big dams down in the southeast, so hydroelectric. And it was Bonneville Power in the northwest, which built a lot of dams in like Washington, Oregon. And a bunch of other power agencies which eventually started building their own coal plants, oil plants, hydroelectric, all of these types of things. But it was publicly owned. And even from the beginning, some cities said, we're not going to let some corporation come in and run our power. We're going to start our own power company. And so you had these municipal utilities from the beginning serving major cities around the country. I wonder if I should develop a map now. I'm going to do one more thing before I develop a map. Is there anyone on Stack or
No.
checking in? Okay.
And time check, 7:44.
Yep, we're getting close to our end here. So in the early part of the 20th century, there were corporate utilities serving many of the cities in the country, and municipal utilities, government-owned utilities, serving most of the other cities in the country. But nobody wanted to serve rural communities. And essentially the reason was, for every mile of wire you have to build, you get a certain number of customers. If you're in the city, you might get 1,000 customers for a mile of wire. If you're out in rural Minnesota or rural anywhere, you might get 3 or 4. And so these companies wanted to build power plants and electrical distribution systems that would serve the places where the load was cheapest and most affordable for them to serve. So they just went out to the limits of the city, or maybe to a factory or manufacturing plant a little bit outside the city. And that's where they delivered power, and they essentially didn't want to go any further. And over time, people in rural communities got very upset about the fact, because none of these companies were providing them with electricity. And early on, it was a very grassroots effort for the rural communities to actually form cooperatives, so member-owned cooperative organizations, just like they had formed member-owned agricultural co-ops and milk co-ops and all these other co-ops, to route electricity to rural communities. And like early on, it was very makeshift, do-it-yourself. I've read stories of some of the early farmers. They were conducting electricity using barbed wire because they had barbed wire. That's what they made fences out of. So, you know, very inefficient, not the right type of metal, plus it's got all those little barbs creating resistance everywhere, just a bad situation. But it's what they could do.
And not insulated.
And not insulated, right? Totally. Bad situation, but it's what they could do because nobody was providing them with service. And in the 1930s, as part of the Depression-era FDR programs, the federal government essentially came in with massive loan financing to finance the formation of large-scale rural electric co-ops. And this was the era of rural electrification, largely between the late 20s and early 50s is when most of rural America got power.
Wow. That's not very long.
No, it's not very long ago. And so they essentially got large-scale financing from the federal government at dirt-cheap interest rates to build long-distance power lines through all these rural communities, to build power plants that would generate power for these rural communities, and basically build out the system. So by about the middle of this last century, essentially everyone in the country, nearly, I mean, there's still reservations that don't have power and communities that are not served, but nearly everywhere in the country by about the end of World War II had electricity. And it was divided in mostly corporate investor-owned utilities controlling most of the cities and urban areas, and pretty rapidly the suburbs. Municipal utilities covering some of the rest of the urban and suburban areas. And then rural co-ops, which served all the rural areas. And those rural co-ops nowadays serve about 14% of the people in the country, but they serve about 80% of the geography of the country.
Can you say that one more time? Sorry.
So rural electric co-ops serve about 14% of the people in the country, but they serve about 80% of the geography of the country. Because they're rural, they serve rural areas. So if you look at a map, and I haven't done very much visual, online graphics, you can find maps of utility service territories, and you'll see these tiny little squiggles of these investor-owned utilities and municipal utilities that are all concentrated in the urban centers, and they have the vast majority of the energy usage. And then you have these rural co-ops that are giant areas of the rural part of the country.
How many very large organizations like Excel, for example, are there?
Yeah, so we're talking about numbers now.
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, so the question was, how many large companies are there that provide energy, provide electricity in the U.S.? Many of them are not super large. Right now there are about 220 private corporations that provide electricity. Some of these are extremely large. Duke Energy, I think, is the largest, although the recent Exelon-Pepco merger may have made them the largest, I don't remember. But these are companies that serve 10 million or more customers across a large geography. There are also relatively small investor-owned private utilities, but there's about 220 of those overall. There's over 2,000 municipal utilities. And this is all the way from big cities like Los Angeles or Austin, Texas, or actually the entire state of Nebraska is public power, it's municipal power. So there's quite a few of them, but there's also lots of little communities. There's, just here in Minnesota, there are about 150 municipal utilities, mostly in smaller communities. And then there's about 800 rural electric co-ops. So there's a wide diversity of these companies all over the country. For a very long time, until deregulation started to happen in some states about 20 or 30 years ago, which we'll talk about next time, each utility has a monopoly within its own territory. So it is the only company that serves customers in that territory. Just checking. Cool. Please shout out if you have any questions. Otherwise, I'm going to move on to give you kind of the last diagram of today that we'll use as a foundation for next time. So nowadays, what we do is we have a network of large power plants. So we have coal power plants, we have nuclear power plants, we have natural gas power plants. Increasingly, we have wind turbines and some solar in there. You get the picture. These are very, wind being a significant exception. Each of these are very large power generating facilities. And so you have to move this energy from where it's being produced as electricity to where it's used. And so we have these very large-scale high-voltage transmission lines. So these are not the kinds of things that you're going to see walking down the street. These are the types of things you might see that are like 150 feet tall when you're like driving on the highway. These are transmitting very high-voltage power long distances, hundreds or in some cases thousands of miles. And then when you get into a community, you have a substation. You've probably seen these. They're kind of like a mess of metal structures and connectors, and there's insulators and so forth. And essentially what this does is it takes the high voltage power that's coming off of these wires and steps down to a lower voltage. And then coming from these substations, you have the smaller power lines that you'll see in your neighborhoods and communities that are coming from the substation at a lower voltage. And on each of these power lines, or on each of the poles, or many of the poles, you'll see these little boxes. Usually maybe 2 feet tall, maybe a foot in diameter. Sometimes they're square, sometimes they're round. And these are transformers which step the power down to a lower voltage a final time to the wires that go into your main circuit breaker in an individual house. And there's different voltages that will go into like a larger office building or a factory. So you have these different pieces. You have the generation. That's all the places the energy is made. You have the transmission, which is the high voltage movement of massive amounts of power into a community. And then locally in the community, you have the substation and local power lines, and that's all called distribution. So generation, transmission, distribution.
Distribution is always after the local substation?
Yes. Yep. You can think of, I've worked with some organizers who are very excited about popularizing the idea of the substation watershed, or like the substation neighborhood, building community and solidarity in an energy democracy system based on all the people who share the same substation. Because electrically and in terms of the grid, that is the local unit, everything coming out of your substation. And we can talk way more about the mechanics of that in later trainings. I want to emphasize that all of these systems are interconnected, so I all drew these coming into one point, but really there's networks of transmission lines like that. And that's really valuable because if there's a fault anywhere in one of these lines, the electricity can flow through all the other routes. That does create problems, which we'll talk more about in our next training, but just understanding this is all a network. And it crosses across many different utilities. So there is one grid, and maybe one utility controls these power plants and all the customers in this area, and another utility controls that nuclear power plant and all the customers in that area, and you have a third utility over here. And there's going to be substations and customers all in the midst of all this. So when you flip a switch, you are getting power from some number of power plants dispersed across a broad geography, and you really have no idea which power plant it's coming from, because it just flows through all the wires virtually at the speed of light. Not quite, but of course, real fast, real fast. Is this making sense? Cool. Let me just check my time. I wanted to add one quick infrastructure thing that I haven't talked about yet. I mostly focused on electricity because it is sort of the most universal. It is the largest chunk of a utility system economically, and there's a lot of exciting things going on here. But I also want to emphasize that we have a heating system as well. And in many parts of the country, we heat with natural gas, which is, again, fracking or other types of gas extraction. And that's piped through a series of pipelines, both very high volume pipelines across long distances. And then you have compressor stations and other things like that that split it into smaller pipelines going out to individual communities and ultimately into individual businesses and homes. This is not as universal because we never decided at any point in society that everyone in the country needed natural gas pipelines, and it would be very, very expensive to create natural gas pipelines serving all sorts of communities around the country, including small rural communities. So a lot of rural communities, instead of gas, will heat with either electricity, because they have electric wires, or they will get propane or fuel oil or other types of liquid fuel delivered by truck. And so in some of these communities, you'll see those kind of big, they're just like shaped like giant pills that are just like propane or other fuel gas containers. And those are delivered by truck and then provide the fuel that heats those buildings. So that's another kind of analogous utility system. In most communities, electricity is by far the largest source, and in fact, in most of the southeastern U.S., they often don't even have non-electric heating systems because there's not very much heating. And in many parts of rural Minnesota, it's also just electric, and much of the upper Midwest. Here in Minnesota, if you look at it from an economic perspective, natural gas is about a third to maybe 40% of the fuel usage and expense, and electricity is the other 60% to 2/3. No, of energy, utility energy use.
Include automobiles?
No. So we're not talking about transportation. There's a whole liquid fuels thing there that ties in, and especially in terms of how gas plants and natural gas heating tie in, those markets are deeply interrelated. But just to kind of give us a map of the system. I am about at close. It is 7:59. I wanted to see if there are any quick questions before we close.
At the different stages of distribution for like starting a coal plant or any alternative electricity, there's homes at different levels. Like, I'm trying to think of like a map, what the resistance and the energy loss, what the inefficiency at different distribution levels.
Sure. So the question is about energy loss, and that's actually a little bit different from resistance. Resistance is one of the forms of energy loss. I think this is actually valuable just to go through really quickly. At your average power plant, the efficiency of conversion is somewhere between 30 and 40%. So, oh, that's bad. Sorry, y'all. So at a coal plant, about 30% of the energy that is in the coal gets turned into electricity. The rest is waste heat. Natural gas plants are a little bit more efficient. They're more like 40%, some of them up to 45%. It all varies based on the power plant. The thing I want to emphasize there is you put 10 trains of coal into a power plant, only 3 trains actually get turned into electricity. So we're wasting massive amounts of energy just in the burning. Then in the transmission and distribution, you lose about another 10 to 12%.
Oh my God.
Okay, so you're at 30%. Okay, this is efficiency. Actually, I should write this in terms of losses. So the loss here is 70%. The loss here is an additional 10 to 12% of the 30% that remains. So this compounds. And then most of our end-use appliances are only about 10 to 30% efficient, depending on the appliance. Okay, an incandescent light bulb is only about 5% efficient. So in many cases, for 100 of units of energy that you put in at the power plant, you get 2 or 3 out at this end. That's the efficiency of our system. Perhaps the inefficiency of our system.
That's horrible.
That's amazing.
Oh my God, that's so bad.
Again, this would not be feasible if we didn't have massive amounts of economically cheap fuel lying around for us to do whatever we wanted with, and be totally willing to waste 95% of it. Cool.
On that note.
On that note, I hope this has been useful. Again, sorry for the technical difficulties at the beginning. I was just checking to see if anyone else had a comment. Next time, we will be focused on what is currently going on in the utility system and sort of what are the big forces that we as movement people can use to shift the way this works. So thank you all.
Thank you, Timothy and Patty, and everyone else who helped put this together. Really, really good.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Have a great night.
Thanks.
Everybody.
Bye. Love to all the folks in Twin Cities and around the country.
Bye. Love to you too. Oh. Oh.
Aww.
Okay, I'm gonna take us off the broadcast.